Content warning. This documentary contains discussions of war and crimes against humanity. Viewer discretion is advised. He was a failed artist living in Vienna's homeless shelters, rejected twice by the Academy in 1907 and 1908. Just 3 decades later, Adolf Hitler unleashed a dictatorship that dragged millions into war and murdered millions more. The making of a dictator, Adolf Hitler, is not just the story of a man, but of how personal grievance and conspiracy thinking grew into one of history's greatest crimes. What turned a disillusioned veteran into the architect of Nazism, a regime universally condemned for its hatred and brutality? The answer begins long before the world took notice, in the forgotten years where extremist ideas first took root. Content warning. This documentary contains discussions of historical events involving violence and discrimination. Viewer discretion is advised. Vienna in the early 1900s offered little comfort to a young man with no diploma, no steady income, and no family left to fall back on. After his second rejection from the Academy of Fine Arts in 1908, Adolf Hitler's life narrowed to a routine of survival. By 1910, he was just one of hundreds at the Meldemannstrasse men's hostel, his days shaped by the strict schedules and thin comforts of communal living. Rent was cheap, the beds were hard, and the reading room became a second home. Each morning, Hitler took up his spot in the non-smoking section, scanning newspapers, painting watercolors to sell for coins, and launching into heated debates with anyone who would listen. Eyewitnesses described a young man who bristled at criticism, his voice rising when challenged, unable to let a slight go unanswered. The hostel was a crossroads for men from every corner of the empire: Czechs, Poles, Jews, Germans, each with their own story of disappointment or hope. Hitler's circle included Jewish residents like Josef Neumann, who lent him money and shared in long conversations about politics and art. Samuel Morgenstern, a Jewish shopkeeper, became one of his most reliable customers, buying paintings week after week. Even as Hitler absorbed the city's anti-Semitic pamphlets and newspapers, his daily reality contradicted the stereotypes. The people who gave him work, who helped him through the leanest winters, were often the very ones he would later single out as enemies. Beyond the hostile doors, Vienna's politics churned with resentment and spectacle. Mayor Karl Lueger, famed for his sharp tongue and populist tactics, used anti-Semitic slogans to rally voters, but kept close ties with Jewish business leaders. His message was flexible, shaped by the crowd, and it left a mark on Hitler's understanding of how to win support. The city's other firebrand, Georg von Schonerer, pushed a harder line: pan-German, anti-Catholic, anti-Slav, and fiercely racist. Their methods, emotional speeches, scapegoating, appeals to tradition, became a template for the propaganda Hitler would later perfect. In the cramped hostel, Hitler rehearsed these lessons. He practiced speeches, tested arguments, and found that anger could be a tool if wielded just right. Yet for all the talk of ideology, much of his energy went into simply getting by. Selling paintings in the city's cafes, scraping together enough for bread, and watching others rise and fall, Hitler's frustrations grew. He blamed the art world for shutting him out, the city for not recognizing his talent, and the system for keeping him in poverty. The sense of being overlooked, of having his ambitions thwarted, settled into a permanent grievance. Over 3 years at Meldemannstrasse, these experiences hardened into a worldview. The daily grind of marginalization, the mix of ethnicities and faiths, the populist rhetoric on every street corner, each fed the conviction that someone else must be at fault for his failures. The patterns of resentment and blame, shaped in Vienna's crowded dormitories and noisy reading rooms, would soon find a stage much larger than the back streets of the imperial capital. Content warning. This documentary contains discussions of war and extremist ideologies. Viewer discretion is advised. War broke out in August 1914, and within days, Adolf Hitler volunteered for service in the Bavarian army. He was assigned to the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, not as an officer, but as a dispatch runner, a role that kept him just behind the front lines, but still close enough to the fighting to witness the chaos of trench warfare. The regiment fought at Ypres, the Somme, and Passchendaele, names that became shorthand for slaughter. Over 4 years, Hitler's unit lost more than 3,000 men. He was wounded twice, and in October 1916, he was hit in the leg by shell fragments. In October 1918, he suffered temporary blindness from a British mustard gas attack near Ypres. He spent weeks in a field hospital in Passewalk, north of Berlin, as the war ended. The armistice arrived on November 11, 1918. For soldiers like Hitler, the news landed like a betrayal. He later described the moment as a second blow that left him physically and emotionally shattered. In the hospital, rumors swirled. Germany had not lost on the battlefield. Instead, politicians at home, socialists, communists, and Jews, had supposedly undermined the war effort. This story, known as the stab-in-the-back myth, spread quickly. It was championed by military leaders like Erich Ludendorff and Paul von Hindenburg, who refused to accept responsibility for defeat. The legend offered a simple answer to a complicated disaster. For many veterans, it was easier to believe in betrayal than to face the reality of military collapse. Hitler was awarded the Iron Cross First Class in August 1918, a rare honor for someone of his rank. He wore the medal for the rest of his life. But the pride of decoration was hollowed out by the bitterness of defeat. The camaraderie of the trenches, where men depended on each other for survival, gave way to suspicion and resentment, as returning soldiers struggled to find meaning in a shattered Germany. The army demobilized, jobs vanished, and the old order dissolved in revolution and street violence. Many veterans felt abandoned, their sacrifices ignored by the new Weimar government. The myth of betrayal became a rallying point. Hitler clung to it, convinced that Germany's humiliation could be avenged only by rooting out the traitors he believed responsible. The war had given him a sense of belonging and purpose. Its end left him with a vendetta. He joined a growing chorus of voices blaming defeat not on the generals or the battlefield, but on internal enemies. The story, repeated in barracks, beer halls, and veterans clubs, turned personal loss into political fuel. The trauma of the front lines, the shock of defeat, and the lure of conspiracy set the stage for his next move. Hitler left the hospital not just as a wounded veteran, but as a man searching for someone to blame and a cause to serve. Content warning. This documentary contains discussions of historical events involving violence and discrimination. Viewer discretion is advised. In the years after World War I, Germany's economy collapsed under the weight of reparations, inflation, and then the global depression. By 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work. That was nearly 1 in 3 adults. Factories shuttered, banks failed, and lines for bread stretched across city blocks. For families that had once thought themselves secure, the ground shifted overnight. Savings evaporated. The middle class, shopkeepers, clerks, teachers, found themselves selling furniture just to buy food. The sense of betrayal ran deep. Politicians in Berlin seemed powerless, paralyzed by endless debates and shifting coalitions. The Reichstag, Germany's parliament, met and argued, but rarely acted. No party could command a majority. In 1930, the Nazis were still seen by many as a fringe movement, but when the ballots were counted that September, their share of the vote had jumped to 18.3%. It wasn't a majority, but it made them the second largest party in the country. The pattern was clear. As unemployment rose, so did support for Hitler's party. Cities like Hamburg and rural Protestant districts in the north posted especially sharp gains. The connection was not subtle. Nazi votes tracked the jobless rate town by town. Joseph Goebbels, the party's chief propagandist, seized on the crisis. Nazi posters promised bread, work, and national renewal. Their rallies offered spectacle and certainty. Hitler's speeches blamed Germany's misery on the Treaty of Versailles, the failures of democracy, and the supposed enemies within, communists, socialists, and Jews. The message was simple. Only the Nazis could restore order and pride. For millions desperate for hope, it was enough. But even as support surged, the Nazis never won a majority in a free election. In July 1932, they reached their high watermark with 37.3% of the vote. The next election, in November, saw their share slip to 33%. The Reichstag remained deadlocked. The government lurched from crisis to crisis, with presidents and chancellors ruling by emergency decree. Many Germans, battered by years of hardship, began to doubt that democracy could solve anything at all. The sense of exhaustion and anger brought the country to a breaking point, and the Nazis to the very threshold of power. Content warning. This documentary discusses the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. It is intended for educational purposes and explicitly condemns Nazi ideology. On January 4, 1933, Adolf Hitler stepped through the door of Kurt von Schroeder's villa in Cologne. Waiting inside was Franz von Papen, the recently ousted chancellor who had come to broker a deal. Germany's government was paralyzed, with no party holding a majority and the Nazis' support slipping in the polls. Papen, bitter about his own fall and eager to regain influence, saw Hitler as a tool, someone who could be placed in the chancellor's seat, then boxed in by a cabinet full of conservatives. The plan was simple on paper: 3 Nazi ministers, 8 conservatives. Hitler would be chancellor in name, but Papen and his allies believed real power would stay in their hands. The meeting at Schroeder's house lasted 4 hours. Hitler made his demand clear: nothing less than the chancellorship. Papen agreed, banking on the idea that Hitler's lack of experience would make him easy to control. Outside, leading industrialists and bankers like Schroeder watched with approval, convinced that a strong government, even one led by the Nazis, was the only way to restore order and protect their interests. The business community's support wasn't just moral. It kept the Nazi Party afloat during a period of financial crisis, when party membership and donations were both falling. President Paul von Hindenburg, remained the last obstacle. He had no love for Hitler, famously dismissing him as that bohemian corporal, and had refused his demands for the chancellorship throughout the previous year. But Papen, with help from Hindenburg's son Oskar and State Secretary Otto Meissner, pressed the case relentlessly. Oskar, who had opposed Hitler for months, changed his mind after a private meeting at Joachim von Ribbentrop's house. Whatever Hitler said in that hour, it worked. Oskar left convinced there was no alternative but to bring the Nazis into government, and his father's resistance began to crumble. As January wore on, Papen and Hitler hammered out the final details. Hitler would be chancellor, Papen vice-chancellor, and only two other Nazis, Wilhelm Frick and Hermann Göring, would join the cabinet. The rest would be filled by conservatives and members of the German National People's Party, who believed they could keep Hitler in check. On January 29th, at Papen's apartment, Hitler revealed his true intentions. Once in office, he planned to dissolve the Reichstag and use a new election to secure a majority for the Nazis. With that, he would seek powers to govern without parliament at all. Papen, still confident, brushed off concerns. In 2 months, we'll have pushed Hitler so far into the corner that he'll squeal, he told his colleagues. On the morning of January 30th, 1933, President Hindenburg signed the appointment. Hitler became chancellor in a brief ceremony at the presidential palace. That evening, SA and SS men marched through Berlin in torchlit parades. The new government looked, on the surface, like a coalition. But the legal door had been opened. Within weeks, Hitler would use the powers granted him not to share authority, but to sweep aside every limit the conservatives thought they had built. The gamble that Hitler could be contained had been made. The consequences would unfold with relentless speed. Content warning. This documentary contains discussions of historical events involving violence and oppression. Viewer discretion is advised. Smoke still hung over Berlin when the government issued the decree for the protection of people and state on February 28, 1933. The order was signed by President Hindenburg at Hitler's urging, just hours after the Reichstag building burned. The text spelled out what it took away: personal liberty, the right to free speech, freedom of the press, the secrecy of mail and telephone, the right to assemble, and the right to form associations, all suspended until further notice. Police could now search homes without warrants, detain people indefinitely, and ban publications or meetings they considered dangerous. The decree didn't set an end date. The promise of due process vanished overnight. The Nazis didn't wait for the ink to dry. That morning, police arrested thousands of communists and social democrats. By the next week, every major opposition newspaper had been shut down or taken over. The SA and SS patrolled the streets, breaking up gatherings, storming party offices, and intimidating anyone suspected of disloyalty. In Prussia alone, more than 4,000 political opponents were detained in makeshift camps by mid-March. The regime called it protective custody. There was no trial, no appeal, and often no explanation. With the opposition in disarray, Hitler called for new elections on March 5th. The campaign was anything but free. Nazi stormtroopers lined polling stations, and rival candidates campaigned under the threat of violence. The Nazis and their allies won 43.9% of the vote, still short of a majority, but enough to dominate the new parliament. Communist deputies were barred from taking their seats. Social Democrats faced constant harassment, with dozens already arrested or in hiding. The Reichstag convened under the gaze of SS guards, with the chamber itself still blackened from the fire. On March 23rd, deputies filed into the Kroll Opera House. SA men filled the galleries, and the sound of boots echoed off the marble floors. Hitler introduced the law to remedy the distress of people and Reich, the Enabling Act. It would allow his cabinet to make laws without parliamentary consent, even if those laws broke the Constitution. Passage required a 2/3 majority. With 81 communist seats vacant and 26 Social Democrats missing or detained, the numbers were stacked. The Center Party, after tense negotiations and promises from Hitler, agreed to support the bill. Only 94 Social Democrats voted against it. The final tally: 444 in favor, 94 opposed. The law passed. That vote gave Hitler the power to rule by decree. The Reichstag would never again act as a check on the executive. Within weeks, state governments were dissolved or brought under Nazi control. Trade unions were outlawed. All parties except the Nazis disbanded or were banned. The old legal order had been hollowed out, replaced by a system where the law flowed from the will of a single leader. The transformation was written in official decrees, signed at a desk, and enforced by men in uniform. The machinery of democracy had been turned against itself, and the door to dictatorship stood wide open. Content warning. This documentary contains discussions of historical events involving violence and oppression. Viewer discretion is advised. Dawn broke on June 30th, 1934, with SS men already moving through the streets of German cities. Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA, was still asleep at the Hanselbauer Hotel in Bad Wiessee when Hitler and his entourage burst in. Röhm and his top commanders had been lured there on false pretenses. Within minutes, they were under arrest. Across Germany, similar scenes played out as SS squads detained or executed dozens of SA leaders. By noon, the operation had spread to Berlin, Munich, and other cities. The SA's once formidable leadership was cut down in hours. The official story painted the purge as a response to an imminent coup, but the list of victims told a different story. Alongside Röhm, at least 84 people were confirmed killed. Some historians put the number closer to 200. The dead included not only SA officers like Edmund Heinz and Karl Ernst, but also old political enemies and inconvenient allies. Former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher was shot in his home with his wife. Gregor Strasser, once a rival for control of the Nazi Party, was executed in his cell. Gustav von Kahr, who had blocked Hitler's 1923 putsch, was murdered in Dachau. Others, like journalist Fritz Gerlich and Catholic leader Erich Klausener, were targeted for their criticism of the regime. Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The true number of those killed, disappeared, or driven to suicide remains uncertain, as the regime destroyed records and covered its tracks. Hitler waited 3 days before announcing what had happened. On July 13th, he told the Reichstag that he had become the supreme judge of the German people. The killings, he insisted, were necessary to save Germany from chaos. The cabinet declared the purge legal after the fact. President Hindenburg, frail and near death, sent a telegram congratulating Hitler for restoring order. In the streets, the SA was broken. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, stepped into its place as the new instrument of terror. Less than 5 weeks later, Hindenburg died at his estate in East Prussia. Within hours, Hitler issued a decree merging the offices of President and Chancellor. On August 2, 1934, the German armed forces gathered to take a new oath. Gone was the pledge to the Constitution or the German state. The new oath bound every soldier personally to Adolf Hitler. I swear by God this sacred oath that I shall render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, and that I shall at all times be prepared, as a brave soldier, to give my life for this oath. This change was more than symbolic. The army, which had once seen itself as a guardian of the nation, now swore loyalty to a single man. Officers who had hesitated to support Hitler during the purge now fell in line. The last independent institution in Germany had surrendered its autonomy. In a single summer, the legal and physical limits on Hitler's power vanished. The price was paid in blood, signed into law, and sealed by the personal loyalty of the military. From that moment, there was no legal path left to challenge the man who now called himself Führer. Content warning. This documentary contains discussions of historical events involving violence and totalitarian regimes. Viewer discretion is advised. By 1934, Adolf Hitler had transformed a fragile democracy into a totalitarian regime through a series of documented legal maneuvers and violent purges. These are exemplified by the Enabling Act and the Night of the Long Knives. These events, supported by official decrees and survivor testimonies, reveal how resentment, economic crisis, and institutional weakness enabled the rise of one of history's most destructive dictators. Yet some questions persist, such as the full extent of elite cooperation and the fate of certain purge victims, which remain partly obscured in classified or lost records. The consequences of these actions led to unprecedented crimes against humanity and the devastation of World War II. Facts established by post-war trials and millions of archival documents. Today, historians emphasize the dangers of unchecked power and the erosion of democratic safeguards, lessons drawn directly from these verifiable events. The story of Hitler's rise is a warning, evidenced in the historical record, that democracy requires constant vigilance and active protection.